Tehran is facing the fastest air defense collapse in modern military history. In less than 4 days, a shield built over 3 decades, layered with Russian technology and buried under mountains, was torn apart. The party responsible for this is not a single country, but a machine, a combined American and Israeli war machine that turned Iran's skies from a fortress into an open door. Tehran's generals did not see this coming, not at this speed, not with this precision. You're about to understand exactly how a nation that spent 30 years preparing for this exact war lost control of its own airspace in under a week. And you'll be very surprised to learn what happened after, because the story does not end where you think it does. Iran's supreme leader once boasted that the skies over Tehran were a graveyard for enemy aircraft. Air defense commanders paraded their S-300 batteries and homegrown Bavar 373 systems as proof that Iran had built something no other regional power possessed. A layered, mobile, redundant shield capable of absorbing any strike. For years, this was not empty propaganda. Western defense analysts genuinely rated Iran's integrated air defense network as one of the most complex non-NATO systems in the world. It combined old Cold War infrastructure with new domestically built radar, all wrapped around a philosophy of dispersal and deception, systems on trucks, decoys in tunnels, and command nodes buried deep enough to survive a direct hit. Now I will show you an image that Iranian state television never wanted the world to see. This is what remains of one of Iran's most advanced early warning radar stations, hit within the first hours of the campaign, before most of the country was even aware a war had started. And this was not a lucky strike. This was the end result of a plan that had been assembled for years, waiting for the right moment. But here is where things get really strange. The collapse of Tehran's skies did not begin with bombs. It began with silence, a silence engineered by machines that never fired a single missile. The first move in this campaign was not kinetic, it was electronic. In the hours before a single fighter jet crossed into Iranian airspace, American and Allied cyber and electronic warfare units had already begun blinding and spoofing Iran's early warning network. Radar screens that should have shown incoming aircraft instead showed clutter, false returns, or nothing at all. Command centers that should have been coordinating a nationwide response were instead reporting conflicting, delayed, or completely fabricated pictures of the battlespace. This is the part of modern warfare that never makes it into the dramatic footage, but it is the part that decides everything. An air defense system is not just missiles and radar dishes, it is a nervous system. And Iran's nervous system had already been partially severed before the first strike aircraft even took off. This is the moment when 3 decades of Iranian air defense doctrine collided with a level of multi-domain warfare Tehran had never faced before. Phase 2 came fast, and it came from the top down, not the bottom up. Rather than grinding through hundreds of individual missile batteries one at a time, the campaign targeted the people who would have coordinated Iran's response. Within the opening waves, senior commanders across the Iranian military and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps were killed in coordinated strikes on command facilities. Iran's own state media confirmed that senior officials, including top generals and members of the security establishment, were eliminated within the first day. This is called decapitation warfare, and its purpose is simple and brutal. You do not need to destroy every single air defense battery in the country if the officers who would have redirected those batteries in real time are no longer alive to give the order. An air defense network built for redundancy still needs a brain to function. Iran's brain had just been cut out. Now we must look at the actual physical shield itself, because this is where the story becomes almost impossible to believe. Iran's most capable imported system, the Russian-made S-300, had already been quietly gutted more than a year before this war even began. In an earlier round of strikes in 2024, Israeli aircraft targeted the S-300 batteries protecting Iran's most sensitive nuclear facilities near Isfahan. By October of that year, the remaining S-300 capability at Iran's disposal had been destroyed. This detail changes everything about how this new war unfolded. Iran did not enter this conflict with its air defense network at full strength. It entered already wounded, relying heavily on its domestically produced Bavar 373 system and a patchwork of shorter-range point defense platforms, alongside older Cold War-era leftovers that had not been upgraded in years. When the current campaign began, this already weakened network was hit again and hit everywhere at once. Conflict monitoring organizations, tracking the war, documented hundreds of individual Iranian air defense assets targeted in the opening phase alone. Air bases across the country, from Tabriz in the northeast to Shiraz in the south, saw fighter aircraft destroyed on the ground before they could even attempt to intercept anything. Iranian jets, some of them decades-old Northrop F-5s and McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantoms, aircraft that belong in a museum rather than a modern battle space, were caught sitting on runways and turned into wreckage within hours. By the 4th day of the campaign, defense analysts who had spent their careers studying Iran's air defense doctrine were forced to admit something remarkable. Iran's layered shield, the one built specifically to make an American or Israeli air campaign slow, costly, and uncertain, had fallen in roughly 96 hours. Analysts writing for defense outlets described this as one of the fastest large-scale air defense collapses against a genuinely prepared, non-NATO adversary in modern history. For 30 years, American war planners had quietly worried about exactly this scenario: a Middle Eastern power with real depth, real redundancy, and real intent to make the skies expensive. Iran was supposed to be the nightmare case. Instead, it became the case study in how fast a modern integrated air defense network can be dismantled when cyber, space, and air power are combined into a single, synchronized assault. Within days, the physical proof of this collapse became impossible for Tehran to hide. Slow, low, and vulnerable aircraft, the kind that would never be sent into contested airspace, B-52 bombers, began flying missions directly over Iranian territory. These are not stealth aircraft. They are not built to survive a serious integrated air defense network. Sending them over a country is effectively a public statement, a signal that says the threat below has been reduced to the point where even the least survivable aircraft in the arsenal can operate with confidence. For a brief and remarkable window, American commanders spoke about the campaign in terms that would have sounded like fantasy only a year earlier, describing an environment in which strike aircraft could operate at will, hunting targets without needing to fear the kind of layered missile engagement that had defined Iranian doctrine for a generation. But this is only the beginning of the story, and if you think this is where it ends, you are about to be surprised. Because a collapsed air defense network is not the same thing as a defeated country, and Tehran, even wounded and blinded, still had cards left to play. This is where the wall of reality comes into view. Roughly 5 weeks into the campaign, the picture that Washington had been presenting to the world began to crack. Iranian forces, using either a previously hidden system or, according to several Western analysts, an older shoulder-fired missile pulled from a bunker and camouflaged for exactly this purpose, shot down a United States Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle over southern Iranian territory. On the same day, an A-10 Thunderbolt was brought down near the Strait of Hormuz, its pilot ejecting safely into Kuwaiti airspace before being recovered. These were the first confirmed losses of American combat aircraft inside Iranian territory since the war began, and they landed like a shockwave. Not because they reversed the strategic picture, but because they punctured a narrative that had been repeated with total confidence for weeks. Defense officials in Washington had said in plain and unambiguous language that Iran no longer had meaningful anti-aircraft capability, no functioning radar, and no ability to meaningfully contest American aircraft anywhere over its own territory. 2 downed aircraft in a single day did not erase the underlying collapse of Iran's network, but it did force a more honest conversation. Analysts pointed out that Iran's remaining air defense capability was never expected to shoot down large numbers of aircraft. Its purpose, once the main network had fallen, shifted from denial to disruption, using a small number of surviving systems, hidden in tunnels, culverts, and camouflaged positions, to occasionally strike back and force the world to question whether the skies were truly as empty as Washington claimed. This is the part of the story most viral coverage leaves out, and it is the part that actually matters if you want to understand how this war really unfolded. Because while Iran's centralized, layered air defense network genuinely collapsed within days, in exactly the way it was designed not to, Tehran had spent years building a second and completely different kind of resistance, one that did not depend on radar, missiles, or command centers at all. This second front was fought not over Tehran, but over the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which a significant share of the world's oil moves every single day. Instead of trying to win a war of destruction it could never win, Iran shifted its effort downward into what military planners call the air littoral, the low-altitude space just above the water and the coastline, where the enemy's overwhelming advantage in high-end stealth aircraft and long-range missiles matters far less. Here, Iran's primary weapon was not a sophisticated interceptor. It was the Shahed drone, a slow, cheap, low-flying weapon that, by the standards of modern American air power, barely registers as a threat at all. But cheap and slow does not mean ineffective when the goal is not destruction but disruption. Swarms of these drones, alongside anti-ship missiles and naval mines, made transiting the Strait of Hormuz dangerous and unpredictable for commercial shipping and for the American Navy alike. The choke point that carries a massive share of global energy exports became, for a period of weeks, effectively too costly to use. This forced Washington into a second and far less glamorous phase of the war, an economic blockade on Iranian oil exports, intended to apply the pressure that the air campaign of destruction had not managed to deliver. But intelligence assessments concluded that Iran could endure this kind of economic siege for many months longer than expected, while the costs on the other side, rising fuel prices for American consumers, mounting pressure from European and Asian governments, watching their own economies absorb the shock and increasingly nervous questions from Gulf state partners began to accumulate in the other direction. This is the moment where the story stops being a simple tale of American air dominance and becomes something far more complicated and far more interesting. Because the deepest lesson of this war, according to the analysts who studied it most closely, is not that Iran's air defenses held. They did not. They collapsed fast, publicly, and almost exactly the way Washington had hoped. The lesson is that a country does not need to win the war overhead in order to avoid losing the war overall. Iran, correctly reading that, it could never contest American stealth aircraft directly, chose not to try. It ceded the skies over Tehran almost entirely, and instead built its entire remaining strategy around making the war not feel worth finishing. To the country dropping the bombs, populations tolerate acute devastation, sudden and dramatic losses, better than they tolerate chronic, grinding inconvenience, rising prices, disrupted shipping, and a conflict that refuses to produce a clean, decisive ending. Iran understood this asymmetry from the very beginning, and it built its strategy around it. By the time serious ceasefire negotiations began, the picture on the ground reflected this exact split outcome. The United States had achieved something no one seriously doubted: full physical dominance of Iranian airspace, a level of aerial freedom that would have been almost unthinkable against this specific adversary only a few years earlier. Iran's carefully built, decades-old air defense doctrine had been dismantled in a matter of days, not months. And yet, the broader war, the one fought over energy, economics, and endurance, did not produce the kind of clean, one-sided outcome that the opening days of bombing seemed to promise. A framework agreement, still being finalized, points toward an outcome that many defense analysts describe less as a decisive American victory and more as a costly draw, one where the side that lost the skies in 96 hours still managed to extract real leverage in the weeks and months that followed. Let's go back to the beginning. At the start of this story, we showed you the wreckage of Iran's early warning radar, destroyed before most of the country even knew a war had begun. That image is still true, that collapse was real, and it was historic. But the deeper picture, the one revealed by everything that followed in the weeks after, is more complicated and, frankly, more honest than a simple story of total, unopposed dominance. Tehran's generals can no longer credibly claim their skies are a graveyard for American aircraft. But Washington, for all its overwhelming aerial superiority, learned a lesson that will shape how the next conflict in this region is planned: that air superiority alone, no matter how fast or how total, does not automatically decide who walks away from the table having won. Iran's skies fell in days. Iran's war did not end the way anyone in Washington expected it to when those first bombs landed. This is the real story behind the collapse of Tehran's air defense network, and it is a story that is still being written.